Welcome everyone. I see some attendees on the Zoom link. So welcome. My name is Monique Lopez with Pueblo, and we have a fantastic group of panelists here with us today. And we're going to have a great conversation about the history of the untokening and also how to use the mobility justice principles that were developed collectively by the group as well. Tell you a little bit about Transformative Talk Series. It's a collaborative virtual space where community experts can come together to connect, share, and uplift. The Untokening is a multiracial collective that centers the lived experiences of marginalized communities to address mobility, justice, and equity. You can visit the Untokening at the untokening.org, or excuse me, untokening.org, and I'll put that in the chat box as well to learn more. And the next Untokening convening is coming up really soon. It will be in Detroit on November 11th, and we hope to see you there. I can also, in the chat box, put the Facebook event page where you can learn more information. Transformative Talks is produced from Los Angeles by Pueblo in support or with support from People for Mobility Justice, Policy and Programs Organizer Rio Oshas, and Mobility Justice Strategist Adonia Lugo, who wears 3 hats as a collaborator with Pueblo, PMJ, and the Untokening. We will also be broadcasting this on Facebook Live, and we'll make this recording available after today's webinar ends. Feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom if you have any questions, and we do have some time towards the end of the panel discussion to address those questions. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Adonia Lugo to introduce the panelists and today's conversation.
Great, thank you, Monique. I need to get some hats that I can put on during that intro and be like, Adonia Lugo wears 3 hats. I have some hats. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. And today we are going to be talking about the past, present, and future of the Untokening. What is the Untokening? So I'm going to go ahead and let our panelists introduce themselves, if that's cool. So I'll start and I'll just do name, location, connection to Untokening, and pronouns can be our prompt. And we'll go in alphabetical order once I'm done. So it'll be me, and then Naomi, and then Heather, and then Renee. And I guess I meant alphabetical order by last name because those are not actually in alphabetical order. Anyway, I'm Adonia Lugo, based here in Los Angeles, involved in the Untokening from day one as one of the founders and have been a core organizer. I did the programming for our first Untokening convening in Atlanta, and I was a lead co-organizer for Untokening California last fall. I have been less involved with planning Untokening Detroit, but I am super excited to participate in it this Sunday. My pronouns that I use are she, her, hers, and I'll go ahead and pass the intro mic over to Naomi.
Hi, I'm Naomi Dorner. I'm the one you can't see. I'm in a conference room without a video. But I'm Naomi Dorner, and I'm based in Seattle. I've been a collaborator with the Untokening and have known many of the sort of core organizing folks for some time, which we'll talk about. And I do work in transportation. I work on mobility and transportation equity and justice. So really looking forward to the upcoming Untokening convening, our third in Detroit. I have not had an active role in the organizing. It's been really cool to just see what the space has become to so many, and can't wait to participate and have this discussion today. My pronouns are she and her.
All right, alphabetically I'm next. So my name is Heather, and I live in Detroit, and I'm one of the lead co-organizers for the Detroit team. I am only recently affiliated with Untokening, and it's because I sort of stumbled upon it and was reading it and just had a lot of like, yes moments while reading it, and have been thinking a lot about sort of Detroit's struggles with collective mobility and regionalism in particular, and how the city as a whole is sort of tokenized in the context of state and interstate interactions. So my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Hi, I'm Renee Rivera. I'm in Oakland. Until very recently, I was the executive director of Bike East Bay, a regional advocacy organization based here in Oakland. And recently, a few months ago, moved on to now what I'm calling pre-retirement, so taking some time off. But in my pre-retirement period, one of the things I've just been most excited about, but wasn't able to get involved with when I was running an organization, is the untokening. And I've sort of been involved with those conversations since even before there was an untokening. So once I found myself with some free time, I was like, this is first on my list to get involved with. So I am part of the core organizing team for the untokening.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Much appreciating that you're here on this call, even though everybody is involved in their busy lives and workday. And Heather, you're part of the team that is actively getting ready for the event on Sunday. So thanks for making the time. So here's our run of show today. We're going to start with Heather giving us an overview of what's coming up at Untokening Detroit. And then we'll all go around and just share what we're going to be participating in or excited about. And then we're going to talk more about why the untokening, where did it come from, what's the history, why did we want to create this space, and then we'll talk about where we're going next in terms of developing some ways of building leadership and finding ways to empower folks to get involved in this space from a more empowered standpoint. And then we'll talk briefly about the 1.0 Principles of Mobility Justice tool and some of the ways that we're hearing people using it and kind of what we had in mind with that and where it's going. And then we can get into our Q&A. So as Monique said, feel free to enter questions into the Zoom chat box anytime. I think Facebook Live listeners can ask questions there, and we're also paying attention. So I'll go ahead and pass things over to Heather.
Yeah, so we have a full weekend of programming sort of set up. The event, it doesn't officially start till Sunday, but we are hosting a panel called the Cross-City Conversation, which will bring together different panelists from, so we have 2 people from other Rust Belt communities, and then we have 2 people from Detroit, one of whom grew up in Detroit, used transit here, moved to another city, used transit, and then came back, and then one who's a lifelong Detroiter but has used transit other places. So what we're looking to do is really have a conversation about how transit differs and impacts our lives in these different communities to really start off the conference. We have 8 sessions planned. So we have a lot of great speakers, a lot of people who have been doing mobility, advocacy, planning, that kind of thing in Detroit for a long time, though we don't formally have any kind of field like some of these other untokening communities where we can fairly call it mobility justice yet, I think, but we're really excited about getting folks together and sort of making that happen. People are really great. Key highlights, I think, are that we have just got some really exciting faces speaking. So these are folks that I think in the Detroit area, some of them are the usual suspects when you talk about transit, and then some of them are not. So I think that's what I'm especially excited about, is how they're going to interact and like what they have to bring to the table. Is there anything else I should mention?
No, it sounds great. I'll talk about the sessions that I'm going to be part of. So we are going to continue something that's been kind of a tradition in opening the event by having the lead organizers from around the country just do a little pass the mic, you know, where did this thing come from? How have we been involved? So that's in the opening session. And then I will be co-facilitating a session in the first block with Rio Oshas, who's also one of our Transformative Talks producers, around the topic of untokening new mobility. What we have in mind there is actually just kind of doing a go-round of folks in the room to hear how are you seeing micromobility come up in the space where you work, or autonomous vehicles, or whatever the issues might be that you know, we're seeing get a lot of airtime right now, but that aren't necessarily coming out of the kinds of justice and equity rooted conversations that we've been part of. So we'll be doing that session at 10:45. And then I'm also helping with a session in the afternoon in block 3 that is called Burn or Build 2.0. And that is a workshop I'll be co-moderating with Sarah McCullough, Jared Sanchez, and Jeffrey Nolish. And that is building on a session that Naomi co-facilitated at Untokening, California. So I wonder if, Naomi, you would be able to briefly tell us about the original Burn or Build session, and then I can expand on that.
Sure. So I guess I'm trying to remember, digging into the vault. Basically, well, the entire premise of the Burn and Build, which actually was named Power, and it was more about like building power and understanding like how to build coalition power, doing this work. But it ended up sort of taking the name of Build and Burn because of some of the activities that were embedded within the session. But it was led by myself and co-facilitated with Obai Reed, and we really talked about like our personal place, like how we work, where we work, in terms of the work, mobility and justice and equity, and the continuum, right, that it takes to do the work. So, you know, there is the burn, when there are times you do need to burn. What are those times? What are the conditions under which that, what precipitates that action? What does that mean? And then what are the consequences of that? There's also the build strategy. So what does that mean? What does that take? But also, how does that breed or create distrust sometimes, particularly if you're someone that's building and you're on the inside, meaning on the inside in an institution within government or what have you, versus if you're on the outside. So it was really like talking about sort of burn and build strategies in the continuum of strategies, and then also where your positionality is, and also, you know, who your allies are. And then at the end of the day, you know, taking stock and that it takes all of those strategies to dismantle like current systems and recreate them, and really creating value in that, like understanding what the value is to have people wherever they are, recognizing that worth, the work they do, and the value of all that, and the collective power that there is in that, and understanding that there's also many times where, because people are using different tactics, the tactics are often pitted against each other, but it's really incumbent upon us as a collective to understand that, and to know that, and to hold that, you know, to just hold that, and to understand that we're still needing to be on the same page if we have the ultimate vision of like a fair and just, you know, world in which we're operating. So anyway, that's the setup.
Great, thank you. So I didn't get to participate in that session last year because I was co-facilitating a different workshop, but Jared Sanchez, who's one of our co-facilitators for this year's Burn or Build 2.0, was there. And so we've been excited to be building on the model that Naomi just shared. And we are actually going to start our session by pushing back a bit around, you know, burn and build and what that means in the local context in Detroit. Because what the three of us who are not Detroiters heard from our Michigander who's on the panel, Jeffrey Nolish, is that when you're talking about a place where literally, you know, burning buildings and, you know, whether to build new, how do you handle this landscape that has so much so many competing visions for what should be happening. Maybe that's not the best metaphor, but we decided we wanted to keep the title and just kind of open it up with doing some brainstorming around other ways that we can describe the inside and outside divide and working across. So I think it should be fun. So those are the sessions that I'm going to be part of. And overall, I'm just really looking forward to the event. Heather says that she is a newcomer, but the reason why she's in this role is that she reached out a year ago, basically, and, offered her time and offered her leadership. And one thing we really appreciate with the Untokening is, hey, people want to get involved, people want to step up. We would love to figure out how to support you in doing that. So we're really grateful, Heather, that you stepped up and have been a major force in bringing Untokening Detroit together. And what I've observed as someone who has really not been involved much in the planning process, I've only, I think, listened into one planning call. I was really impressed by the fact that some of the folks who are contributing to designing Untokening Detroit and who are going to be involved in the space are coming from the disability community. That's something that in the past, and still in the present, the groups I'm part of, and I know for lots of us who work in the active transportation space and sustainable transportation, that's this gap where we're having to be reminded over and over that we often bring an able-bodied perspective into the work we're doing. So I appreciate that Untokening Detroit is informed by some perspectives that we want to elevate.
Yeah, I want to speak on that a little bit. I think that is definitely one of the unique things about talking about mobility in Detroit is that disability advocates and people with disabilities are very ready and very active already in those spaces. And I think as a result, when you use the term mobility around here, it definitely comes sort of like preloaded with that community, I think, included. And so it's a little bit different. I mean, we definitely struggle with like active transportation forms and things like that. But I think when we're talking about larger mobility, there's a lot of groups around here that are really engaging with that particular aspect of mobility for people with disabilities, because we have such a poor transit system that it's definitely like at the forefront of a lot of those conversations when we're talking about what to do next and how to address it. Because if we don't, we're effectively like isolating those people from their communities. They cannot, the state of the infrastructure is such that they cannot get around the metro region as easily or equitably as they really should be able to.
Great, thanks for that context. Naomi and Renee, do you have anything you want to add about Untokening Detroit before we go on to digging into the history of the Untokening?
No, I think I'm good. I'm not as much in planning space, so I think I'm okay.
Great. Okay, so passing the mic over to you, Naomi, to get us into where this thing came from.
Great, thanks again. So why Untokening? I think as we were chatting about this in our prep call, we were recalling, sort of the places that we've been. And as I mentioned, I've been working in transportation and mobility and advocacy as well. And there, so I guess where I was 5 years ago was working within the advocacy community squarely, and often finding myself, along with a few others in cities elsewhere. At the time I was, I guess, in New York and then New Orleans and now in Seattle, but really, not just talking about how do we do things at the margins to make this slightly better for some people that it's not currently working for, or how do we make our campaigns slightly better. It was like that was sort of where people were, but there was a group of us that were like, well, wait, no, we need to have organizations that are not only reflective of us, but that are really going to be addressing head on, issues in communities of color, low-income communities, communities that, are experiencing the greatest disproportionate outcomes as a result of intentional decisions. And what we were seeing were a lot of the leaders, quote unquote, in the spaces, us ourselves, considered among those leaders, but not as many of us, but a lot of other folks that were kind of advocating for safe streets for all, or policies that were really, at the end of the day, being measured in terms of success by, how much property values went up. And that just felt like it was contributing to the very things that we knew and we heard from the communities of color, and specifically low-income communities, that wasn't actually the kind of mobility, future, or justice that they saw or wanted. And so, I think we found ourselves feeling alone and always sort of having to bring that to the fore, and then ended up finding a community, together, and we were able to kind of talk about these frustrations that we were having as leaders of color in these spaces, where we were, on the one hand, really tokenized. I mean, we were placed on panels, we were put at the head of organizations, and people thought, well, that's what. Great, we've done our diversity work or equity work, but we ourselves were finding ourselves not at all, feeling that was moving the needle in a direction. And so through that community and conversation and experiences, shared experiences, and I think we formed a community and recognized that there was, rather than waiting for space to be created for us where we could address these issues, both in terms of the advocacy as well as in terms of the internal equity work that needed to be done, that we still saw as being needing to be done. We decided we weren't going to wait anymore. We were going to create the space that we wanted to see so that people like ourselves could be our whole selves and bring our perspectives, bring our experiences, and bring our leadership and our leadership styles and skills to the fore, and really work together to move equity into, to move equity together, I guess is the best way to put it, and to create this healing space, strategy space, and collective movement building space. So I'll leave it at that. I know that there are other perspectives, and other, Renee, I'm sure, has plenty to add there as well.
Renee, should I, you want to go? Okay.
Oh no, go ahead, because I mean, what I'm going to say, it kind of comes in the next piece. So go ahead.
Okay, sure. I think Naomi gave a great overview. It has been really hard work bringing the Untokening together for the last few years, but also really rewarding work. And we, as we got started, it was because we knew there needed to be something, or many things, that didn't exist yet. And so we have been, really open over the course of working on Untokening for the last 3 years almost. And I think that is something we want to continue. And one of the ways in which we've been able to maintain that flexibility and that openness is that we are neither a 501c3 or a business. We're a fiscally sponsored project of the Cultural Wellness Center, which is based in the Twin Cities. And that has given us the freedom to do the development work that we need to do. And as Renee will share with us in a few minutes, we do want to do more of that, but to also see ourselves more as a a network building space and a healing space, as opposed to a space where our primary concern is keeping the lights on, or how are we going to expand our services and things like that. We actually don't offer services. Our primary community of concern are individuals who are professionals or want to be professionals in the mobility and transportation space, and who also come from an experience of a lived experience of being part of a marginalized community in some way. And so it has been great for me coming to understand better over time how to talk about the untokening, because we've gotten lots of questions about well, what is it? And I think it's the kind of space where when you attend one of our events, you get it and you're like, this is fun. People seem to have a really good time. And I'm hoping to experience more of what that's like this time around as someone who gets to be a participant for at least a good chunk of it. Because being an organizer, you have your own kind of fun, but it's not quite the same thing as knowing what the attendee experience is like. But yeah, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that the role we play as the Untokening is providing the support and the in a certain kind of sense, the technical assistance for people out there who are trying to figure out how to make a living doing this kind of work. I think that, we're not ourselves consultants so much with the work we do as Untokening, but we want Untokening to be a resource for people who are consultants. There is such a huge need for more people of color, people who come from marginalized communities to be professionals in the transportation and mobility space, not just as workers at existing firms, but actually people who lead their own firms. And so more and more it's becoming clear to me that the stuff that we put out as the Untokening and the real services we offer are kind of in support of that professional community, which then in other aspects of our work, some of us may also be practitioners in that sort of space. But I think as Untokening, it's more about, I don't know, maybe in the future we'll see ourselves as a kind of professional association. That's definitely been something we've talked about in the past.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we're learning too is that because of the way that structures and in the spaces that a lot of us work or have worked, there are structures, and so we're having to undo or unlearn those ways and create our own way, at the same time as being true to our core, which is that we are creating this space, but that it's multiracial and multicultural, and that takes a lot of intentionality and work as well. And we know that we have more work to do in that area as well. And so I think that this has been really this entire experience and the relationships and the space itself of the Untokening and the convening is this really, I don't know, it's become this part of my life, and it's this holistic way of addressing parts that I don't get to address on the day-to-day when I'm doing the equity work in the day-to-day. So.
Great. I think that's a good segue to sort of the what's next question for the Untokening. For me, I've been working the past 8 years as a executive director of a local or regional advocacy group. And when I started that work, 8 years or so ago, I was really shocked that it was a very white, cis, male-dominated space. When I had been doing it as a volunteer thing, I really hadn't realized that because that wasn't what my community looked like. But when I got into national convenings of bicycle advocacy folks, I was like, holy crap, it's all these old white men. What's going on here? And in my 8 years in leadership, there were very few people who looked like me or who I felt like I had a shared background with. So like as a mixed race, gender nonconforming leader, I always had just like maybe one or two people who I felt like were in my same role, who I could pick up the phone with and really have some real talk with. And I think Naomi and I, got to know each other when we were both executive directors of regional groups, and the only two remotely people of color. I mean, we're both mixed, but still, like, everyone else was white. And then I think later when Tamika Butler took over at LA County Bicycle Coalition, it was also this, like, I was like, oh my gosh, someone I can really talk to. And, while she was in her role, like, often I would talk to her, more than once a month. We talked on the phone, we met up, and those relationships, like, were the only way I survived in my role. So I think the untokening for me has been really about creating space where people can connect to each other, because for me that was like this life-saving thing in my role as a leader. And so Naomi and I are going to be leading a session at the Untokening Detroit about actually how do we build leadership in our movement. So it's called Building the Movement, People Movement. And there we want to get people together who are interested in looking at this question: how do we get ourselves into more positions of leadership? What do we envision for ourselves? What are the roles that we want? What are the barriers to getting us into those roles? And how can the untokening really be supporting people of color and other marginalized folks to get into roles of leadership in the transportation movement as a whole? And how do we keep people in those roles? Because the other thing I've seen in the time I've been in my role is people not lasting very long, burning out, because so much is asked of us when we're put in those positions of tokenism within organizations and structures. It's too much to put on one person, and people burn out over and over again. So I'm really interested to see what we learn in this session at the Untokening from the folks who are there. Really excited to see what connections people are making with each other, because for me that's been a key piece of the Untokening, is really just those connections that get built at the event between people that are so sustaining and so, like, just so important. All those conversations. Sometimes I think, the sessions are great, but what happens most exciting is all the conversations that you see people having at the breakfast table and walking between sessions, and like talking between the breakout groups in the sessions. It's all this interstitial connections and conversations that are, like, for me, the heart of what the untokening is. So sometimes it's a little hard to describe to people who haven't been there just how powerful that is. But we want to really take that piece, that networking piece, and also the piece of lifting up particularly POC folks into more leadership in our movement. Because what we know is that, the way the leadership is now is not working. And you hear consultants or people from the agency say, well, we can't, why can't we reach these communities? It's like, well, are you going into those communities and lifting people up into leadership so that there can be a real conversation here? It's hard when you're not making that space for people to step into that kind of agency within their community. So one of the things that we're looking at trying to get funding for as the Untokening is to do more work, not just at these convenings, but throughout the year, to support people to be in leadership, to get into leadership and stay in leadership. And what exactly that looks like, we're, part of the conversations we'll have at this Untokening in Detroit will help us understand what's needed. But that's something kind of, as we started with a convening and then added more convenings, and then now are adding these transformative talks as a way to engage people between the convenings. This is something that we feel like would be a great add-on as a third component that would be a deeper dive with a smaller group of people. So perhaps it'll look like some kind of leadership cohort within the Untokening. And if that's something that you are interested in, or if you are someone who knows about resources that could help support that, we would love to hear about it.
Awesome. Thank you, Renee. I'm really looking forward to seeing what kind of leadership cohort we can design. We have obviously been putting some thought into that, but I hope that folks who come to Untokening Detroit will share what some of their needs are on that front. And I think that, you know, I was just reviewing today the webinar that we did for Transformative Talks last month, which was about new mobility and mobility justice. And it helped me to understand something that I've been trying to put into words for a while now, as we're seeing just this, in my experience, unprecedented, corporate interest in new mobility innovations and things like that. And people who have previously worked in sustainable transportation advocacy, switching over to work for these venture capital funded companies. We're going through this sea change right now in terms of, well, what is, the movement that we're part of. And lots of us, as Renee was saying, and, as Naomi was saying, like where the Untokening came from, lots of us have been engaged for years in the effort to integrate the sustainable transportation world, because we can see how if you got a population that's like this and only this many of that population is represented in who's designing and planning the mobility solutions for everybody, you got about this many people who are not actually at the heart of the solutions that are being offered. And I don't see that changing at all with the new big push that's out there. There still is a real need to work on integration within leadership, within who's benefiting, and looking at equity as this real ownership stake concept, as opposed to having to do with more surface and tokenizing approaches to bringing more folks to the table. And so I think the need to build strong, diverse leadership is more real than ever. And yet, this isn't the first time that I've seen in the world of sustainable transportation that it's easy to become yesterday's news. That's part of the way that tokenism works, is that you might get a lot of fanfare for a minute, and then now we're really interested in this thing over here. So I'm really hoping that at Untokening Detroit and with Transformative Talks and with the leadership cohort we're designing, we can really start to come up with some collective ways of restating our position and making it clear that what we're doing is not somehow like a separate thing from the future of mobility, but rather we have been tinkering and working for years to figure out how to make the future of mobility a more equitable and just space. So finding those connections is going to be super important in developing narratives around, how our work connects with this more tech-driven landscape. I think is really important. And one question I have real quick for you, Heather, because I got it over email, is can people still apply to attend Untokening Detroit? Are there still registration slots available?
Yeah, absolutely. We have to close registration tomorrow because we have to talk to the caterer, but to make sure everybody can eat lunch at the event and breakfast. But right now the application is still open, and we will hold it open as long as we can. We are really interested in people coming, and we really want to encourage folks that are in Southeast Michigan or in the Midwest in general to come. Right now, yeah, so we'll hold it open as long as we can. Definitely it's still open now. And we're moving through the applications as fast as we can with all the other balls we're juggling.
Great. That's what I thought. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to post the link to the info for Untokening Detroit and where you can apply in our chat box here. And I'm going to hop over to, or maybe Monique, maybe you can post the link on our Facebook page, because I'm probably just going to get confused if I try to do that right now. Awesome, thank you. So I would like to point you all toward some of our online resources that we have as Untokening, including the Untokening 1.0 Principles of Mobility Justice. So I am going to share my screen here. Let me make sure that I have the page open that I want to share and just take you all to the Untokening website. All right. Am I showing the Untokening website now? For those who are on video, great. So if you go to the Untokening's homepage, which is untokening.org, and click on resources up on the right, you will see a new page that I've just created where you can look at some of the collective statements that we have put together, of which there are 3. We released a statement about leadership succession and executive hiring in active transportation advocacy in 2017. And then at the end of 2017, we released a document in 2 different versions that was based on notes from the first Untokening convening in Atlanta. And those are the Untokening 1.0 Principles of Mobility Justice and Untokening Mobility Beyond Pavement, Paint, and Place. So both those documents have the same messages, but they're presented in different formats. The 1.0 principles are this cool little, like, very visually engaging set of papers that we're going to have some copies of at Untokening Detroit. You can just see it's like a cool tactile tool designed by Carolyn Chapansky, who is the Untokening communications wizard. And lots of cool images that she put together. And the Untokening Mobility Beyond Pavement, Paint, and Place document is a narrative format of the same material. So we were experimenting a little bit with the fact that some people are more verbal, some people are more visual, and then there's lots of other kinds of learning styles as well. But this was our attempt to at least make things a bit more accessible in terms of how to get into this complex material. And our goal with creating these principles was to get a statement out there of what we know were a lot of shared values and concerns about, needing to expand the meaning of safety in the mobility space, while at the same time, we really didn't want to create something like a checklist that would make the focus go more to the document than the people who were working on mobility justice in a particular town or city. We want these documents to be a resource for people who are in the Untokening network. So again, the people who are, have a lived experience of being part of a marginalized community, who are also working in transportation and mobility and are looking for a collective voice to be representing, so that when they're out there advocating, they aren't just on their own, especially for people who live in places where they don't have a whole huge peer network that they can be drawing on. So since that's kind of that's an unusual way to present a statement or a document, to make it like more of a working tool than something that just anybody can pick up and follow. We've gotten a lot of questions over the last year around what's an appropriate way to use the document, what's an inappropriate way, how should people be putting it into practice? And I think that what makes the most sense to me, and I would be totally curious to hear others' thoughts on this as well, is, as I was saying earlier, this is a resource for people who are working on making a living in this space. And so we want to make sure that people attribute where they're getting this material from. We think it's great for people to mention the Untokening as the source, but really, we want it to be an interpretive tool. We want it to be something that folks are able to put into practice in ways that make sense. And again, not have these documents be something that speaks louder than the real folks on the ground who we're hoping will be able to use it as a platform to get their own realities supported more.
Yeah, if I could jump into that and just kind of share how, when I was at Bike East Bay, sort of how it landed into our organization and what impact that had. I thought it might be helpful in terms of sort of talking about how would you use this, awesome tool. And one piece that I think is really helpful is just the tactile quality of having an actual, maybe because I'm a visual person, like having this actual object, so that when I came back last year from the Untokening convening, you know, I had like could come to a staff meeting and be like, I brought this thing back and I can hand it around and people can actually physically engage with it, which is feels more concrete than just saying, oh, let me tell you what happened at this conference. And I think for us, you know, as a group at Bike East Bay, this was something I think that landed kind of as an affirmation of a lot of conversations and analysis and sort of orientations that we were already engaged in. And I think because we were sort of already midway in our own process of really discovering like where is the intersection between our work and social justice? What does transportation justice mean to us? And of course, one conversation is happening at the staff level and one conversation is happening at the board level. And then even there's another conversation that might be with the broader base of our membership or people who are engaged with Bike East Bay. And it really came in as a way to help bring that conversation together. But I think one of the things that it didn't do, and I think would have been appropriate for it to do, is to be something that we adopted. You know, that we say, oh, we're going to take these principles of mobility justice, put them on our website, attribute them, and be like, oh, we're done. Like that, I don't think that that would have actually been powerful, and I think it maybe isn't quite the right use. But it went into our overall process and helped inform when we were at the point where we're creating our own statement around transportation justice. These principles really informed and affirmed a lot of the work we were already doing. And then, you know, ultimately with our whole board and staff together, we came up with and adopted our own statement around transportation justice, which is on the website. If you can check it out at bikeeastbay.org/equity. And then that wasn't the end of the story either. That still wasn't check the box off, because we then had to take all of that work and integrate it with our strategic plan. So then we went through a process of really building those values and principles into all of our goals as an organization. And so then we came out with a new version of the strategic plan that integrated those things. And I would say even at that point, you can't say check, you're done, because then, you know, there's so much more work to do, and still more in terms of how do we measure this and how do we know that we did it and all, and how are we living into these values that sometimes are very aspirational. So just to like use that example to say it's a very living process, and I think there's a desire to have something that you can just adopt or use as a measuring tool or whatever that might be, but that's not the work. You know, the work really is the work that each person does as an individual around this, around their own relationship to social justice and transportation justice. And it's also the work that the organization does as a whole to really develop its values and aspirations and then figure out how to operationalize them.
And so this is Naomi, and I'll just say, I think that for, you know, myself, I've switched jobs. I was in advocacy actually at the time, and then I was in consulting for myself. I was doing this kind of work as a consultant, helping folks kind of develop strategic frameworks for how to not just, you know, develop principles, but also to operationalize or implement and operationalize. And so for me now in government, it's a very interesting moment, because I'm in a place now where I was part of the co-creation of the principles, and being able to, as Renee was talking about, use those principles as like my personal grounding, but also understanding that the process that it took, like I was a part of that process, and I was one of many people that was a part of that, and it took a very long time to kind of come to a set of principles, and then, you know, creating the space. So and then resourcing that space. So that is sort of the process that I am in my role. currently within government here in Seattle at the Department of Transportation. And so, I think that that's how I personally am using the principles, is really like my grounding and understanding that it's a process and it's about building trust and it's about resourcing community and people to be a part of co-developing those principles that you then, move forth in terms of implementing, operationalizing, and then measuring over time, and being accountable to.
That's great. And actually, I think this is a good segue into doing some Q&A. There's a question about building leadership within the movement and the reality that sometimes people are more focused on building their personal brand rather than building the movement. And so what's the difference between those things? And I think that that's such it's really, it's such an important question. And I think it's one that, we're only beginning to scratch the surface of with untokening. For example, one of the things that we've been discussing recently is the fact that tokenism doesn't happen to everybody in the same way. It doesn't happen to racialized communities in the same way. We started using the term BIPOC last year, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, as I think it was recommended by Zara Alabanza, who's one of the Untokening co-founders and was the lead organizer on Untokening in Atlanta. And so BIPOC is a term that calls out specifically the fact that Black and Indigenous communities have historically been erased and overlooked in ways that, when we use a term like communities of color, people of color, we're contributing to that sort of erasure. And so wanting to call that out. The reality is that using that kind of terminology isn't enough to make a space inclusive or welcoming. And so one of the things that we're really wanting to take on with building a leadership cohort is, what is the tension in this space between people who have the volunteer time to commit to being part of something like this versus somebody who needs to be compensated for being in the space? And how has a certain group of people come together organically, but then, staying in the space has been easier for some rather than others? And what do we need to do to specifically elevate the leadership of people from Black and Indigenous communities if we want to put those groups out there as specifically harmed communities? So that all takes work. And I think that this question of building a personal brand and building a movement is tied in with that, because, how we support particular individuals and being successful in, being transportation and mobility professionals is an ongoing question for Untokening. And how do we ensure that there's energy in the movement and not just, the movement is giving energy to people who are then using it for personal advancement? What are we doing to create the right kinds of channels and pathways so that people can easily be part of both and it's not somehow a choice? Because I don't think it should be. I don't think that there should be some sort of choice that people are faced with in terms of how am I doing in my individual work and what is the energy that I'm giving to this movement. So if these are questions that are interesting to anybody listening, we would love to continue this dialogue in person at Untokening Detroit or just through the Untokening Project. I think we have had an awesome time starting to use the term untokening in an active way. Like I've started using it as a verb, like untokening mobility, what are the untokening actions we can take? But there's a lot more to unpack. There's a lot more specificity to get into. And again, since this isn't a business space, this is a movement space, we are totally open to being challenged about the ways that we haven't currently provided the support that needs to be there for true integration. So let's see, are there other questions or other thoughts that folks want to share? Because we're getting close to time now. Yeah, go ahead, Heather.
If there's time, I'd like to talk about the personal branding thing. I think to add to what you're saying, it's it's very different depending on who you are, like to be affiliated as a personal brand with equity or racial justice. And I think it is something I personally think about a lot because it is such a buzzword, and it became, you know, a buzzword in transportation spaces, I think, relatively recently. And, you know, even in organizing this conference, we came up a little bit against sort of like the buzziness of saying like, oh, this is mobility justice, or oh, this is transit equity, if only because people have heard it so much. There's a little bit, I think, of tiredness around like engaging in that, at least locally. But I think the consequences and the potentiality of like using it to build your personal brand are very different depending on your identity. And if you have a marginalized identity, if you don't, and it, in a way, associating yourself with that language can also be tokenizing. Because that puts you in the equity box, right? And I just think that is so interesting because it's this great positive thing that we want to achieve, integration, but at the same time, we're battling with being locked into only focusing on those issues. And that in and of itself can be very restrictive. So I just want to throw that out.
There is a question over here that is about whether there's going to be live streaming at Untokening Detroit. I think the answer is no.
We have not made a good plan for how to handle that. We can try. I don't want to make any promises.
I think that's probably something that the different facilitators can think about at their session. And yeah, I mean, we've all got our fancy technology that connects us into these online spaces. So I think we can talk about that.
One of the things in the past, you know, and I think that you all in the sort of transformative talks have done a really good job where it's like you have some conversations that are really public facing and they're meant to be shared. And then there are times and spaces, especially when we're talking about our experiences, personal experiences of like tokenization, and you don't necessarily want like that live streamed in terms of, yeah, with colleagues and your work. Or yeah, I think that there are sensitivities with regards to live streaming, and it's really going to be one of those things where it's like the facilitator checks in with the group based on the conversation and knowing that like we want to create safe spaces for people to be their whole selves in ways that, you know, they're not always able to be at their own places of work or professionally, and so that's I think that's a little bit of the tension there, but I think in the past we just would ask, and if people weren't comfortable, we didn't. And I think generally we haven't in the past.
Cool. So thank you all for joining this particular transformative talk, and we hope to see you all in Detroit. If not, you know, there's going to be plenty of other opportunities through the Transformative Talk series to connect where you're at home. Our next transformative talk is actually going to be a family tea time. What that means, it's not a public conversation. It's a closed circle conversation, and so we will be sending out information about that next week. And if you'd like to join that particular talk, there's an email. It actually is Adonia's email, and we'll have that as part of the flyer that you can email her in order to get a personal invitation to this more intimate and private space. As Naomi mentioned, some of these conversations, and we acknowledge, require a little bit more of that care and a private space in order for us to be our full self. Our next Transformative Talk Family Tea Time is the title of that talk is Connection to the Land. and is really going to be focused around our relationship to the land. And this will be taking place on November 21st. Like I said, I'll be sending out information next week on this transformative talk. And if you're interested, please do send an email to Adonia, and that email address will be on the flyer. Again, we hope to see you in Detroit, and feel free to check out untokening.org/webinars to learn more about our upcoming Transformative Talk series. I'd like to say thanks again to Naomi, Lex, Heather, Renee, Adonia for being part of this Transformative Talk, and we hope to see you at the next one. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you Sunday.
Sunday.